Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulillah wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'een. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Alhamdulillah, we are back once again, and this time to offer some clarification on a question that was asked regarding a statement that we presented in a previous video on the status of the Imams an-Nawawi and ar-Rafi'i, rahimahumullah, their opinions representing the mu'tamad of the Shafi'i madhab. So what we would like to do in brief is explain why that is the case. Again, the mu'tamad, the relied upon position in the Shafi'i school for ifta, giving fatwas, as well as qada, judgments, is the corrections, the tashihat, and the tarjihat, the preferred opinions of these two great Imams, an-Nawawi and ar-Rafi'i, rahimahumullah. And the two of them, in the terminology of the Shafi'iyya, are known as ash-Shaykhan. Ash-Shaykhan, literally the two elders, the two Shaykhs, of the madhab. And Imam an-Nawawi, rahimahullah, passed away in the year 676 after the Hijrah, and Imam ar-Rafi'i, rahimahullah, passed away in the year 623. So even though we mentioned an-Nawawi first, due to the fact that he is given precedence over ar-Rafi'i, in chronological order, we would actually put ar-Rafi'i first. Again, ar-Rafi'i passed away in 623 after the Hijrah, and an-Nawawi in the year 676, rahimahumullah. And they are the two Shaykhs. So the question then is, both of these great Imams are Shafi'iyya. That's their madhab. And when we study the levels of ijtihad, we know then that they were not mujtahidun mutlaqun. They were not independent jurists like al-Imam al-Shafi'i himself, rahimahullah. Nor were they what's called a mujtahid muqayyad or mujtahidul madhab, a mujtahid, a jurist whose ijtihad is restricted by the principles of his imam. They weren't at that level either. So if that's the case, and there's another term that the Shafi'iyya use for that lower level of ijtihad after the mujtahid mutlaq and also the mujtahid muntasib, the mujtahid who is ascribed to a school, like al-Muzani, rahimahullah. And then you have, as we said, the mujtahid muqayyad. There's a term for that amongst the Shafi'iyya. They are called ashabul wujuh. Ashab, which is the plural of sahib, ashab al-wujuh, which literally means the possessors of faces. And by faces, what is intended, of course, not literally, but they have a perspective in terms of ijtihad in the madhab, meaning they are what they are capable of doing ijtihad almost at the level of a Shafi'i in terms of the vastness of their knowledge, except their ijtihad, or in their ijtihad, they are following the principles of a Shafi'i. All right, so they're not independent in terms of the principles that they apply in their ijtihad. There they are muqallidun. They are followers of a Shafi'i. But their level of ijtihad is extremely high. Those are ashab al-wujuh. And historically, and what we're speaking of now, this is something that a student of knowledge should benefit from in terms of researching what's called tabaqatul a'imma, the different generations and different ranks of the scholars. So historically, ashabul wujuh and the mujtahidun in the Shafi'i madhab are a couple of centuries, or their time period extends a couple of centuries, and if we're being liberal, we could say maybe even 3 centuries after the time of Ash-Shafi'i. So Ash-Shafi'i, rahimahullah, he passed away in the year 204 after the Hijrah. All right, so 304, that's a century after his death. 404, that's 2 centuries after his death. So that's the 5th century. So really up until maybe about the middle of the 5th century, the mid 400s, you see the scholars of the Shafi'i school are ashab al-wujuh, give or take some decades, all right? But we're not going to get into the details of that. So an-Nawawi and ar-Rafi'i come a few centuries after the time of ashab al-wujuh. And they're not at their level. They are not they're not mujtahidun in the madhab, like the scholars that preceded them in the earliest centuries of the development of the madhab. So that means that they did not have the knowledge that ashab al-wujuh possessed. They did not meet the same qualifications. So how is it that we can claim that what the two shaykhs said is the relied upon position in the madhab over what the ashab al-wujuh said, who are more knowledgeable than the two shaykhs? So that can be looked at from a number of perspectives, but we're going to just break it down to 2 main points. The first is, and this is something that's mentioned by Ibn Hajar al-Haytami rahimahullah, and something that is explained by the scholars of the madhab. Whenever we look at different opinions, ikhtilaf in the school, and this is something that's a part of our development, a part of consolidating our proficiency, when we examine the different opinions and disagreements within the madhab amongst the Shafi'is themselves, particularly ashab al-wujuh, they didn't all agree with one another, their conclusions, their ijtihad. So when we examine their differences, we appreciate them, but what's of more importance is how those opinions were transmitted. This is an extremely important point. How were those opinions transmitted? As is said, and this is something that every student of knowledge or aspiring student of knowledge should memorize and appreciate the full implications of it. Al-madhhabu naql. Al-madhhabu naql. Wan-naqlu amana. Wan-naqlu amana. Al-madhhabu naqlun. Wan-naqlu amana. The madhhab is transmission. And transmission is a trust. So with that being understood, one of the most important things that a researcher in the school has to do is a tahqiq of the naql, a verification of the transmission of different opinions. And who stated those opinions? عزو الأقوال إلى قائليها. All right. Attributing opinions to those that held those opinions and expressed them. So when one undertakes that type of research, what one will find is that it's very possible, and in fact this has occurred, where you might have an individual scholar who was a mujtahid in the madhab and was well known and had an abundance of students that took from him. And those students, with their abundance, produced an abundance of naql, kathratun naql, an abundance of transmission of that opinion. But when you do the proper research, you find that it's not 10, 15 scholars that held that opinion, but rather they're all transmitting from a single scholar. So that's very important. And this is one of the ways that the scholars answered some of the objections to Imam an-Nawawi and Imam ar-Rafi'i being the Shaykhan, meaning that their statement is mu'tamad, which is what some might look at an issue at the surface and say that this is the opinion of the majority. And for that reason, it's the mu'tamad. When in fact, when you do the research, azwul aqwali ila qailiha, you find that what? It's a single individual that expressed that opinion, and then it appears that there's a majority of scholars that gave that same judgment, but in reality, they're just doing naql of that opinion. And there's an abundance of naqala, of transmitters. So it's an important nuance not to be confused by, because it could lead to the wrong conclusion. So that's one aspect. And then the second point is related to that in the sense that what? Imam an-Nawawi and Imam ar-Rafi'i, rahimahumullah, their level in the school is at the level of mujtahid al-fatwa. And you can even say min ahl al-tarjih, meaning that what the two shaykhs, rahimahumullah, what they did is they were not doing ijtihad independently on issues. That was not their concern. That work was already done and done well. But what they did is they looked at the state of the madhab in their time, which was the 7th century after the Hijrah, and they said, you know, there's a lot of disagreement in the school. So those that want to study the madhab and give fatwa according to the madhab and give judgments according to the madhab, if they go to the references of the madhab, they're not going to know which opinion to choose. So what they did was a service to all future generations of Shafi'iyya. They dedicated themselves to sifting through all of the differences of opinion, and then with their proficiency in the usul of the madhab, the principles of the madhab, and the evidences of the madhab, and with their verification of the transmission of the madhab, they put that skill set together and applied it specifically, devoted it specifically to giving judgments on what is the most correct view according to the Shafi'iyya. All right. They sifted through the opinions and presented to us what is the most sound according to the principles of the school. And as we said in a previous video, later scholars that came after them and reviewed their work gave them that status based on the quality of what they contributed. So it's an area of specialization. So to illustrate that with an example, the Ashab al-Wujuh, the mujtahids in the school are vastly knowledgeable. In a general sense, their knowledge is greater than the Two Shaykhs, okay? But the Two Shaykhs applied their knowledge, which is vast in its own right, to a specific area of scholarship. So the quality of that scholarship is higher. Now, what do we mean? Here's the illustration. My mother is an excellent cook. And maybe I'm a little biased because I'm her son, right? But my mother's food, her cooking is delicious for anything that she applies herself to. And she's more knowledgeable of cooking and knowledgeable of recipes, etc., than my father. However, my father specializes in pastries and cakes and pies and cobblers and turnovers, right? All types of desserts, baked desserts. So my father's cakes and pies and turnovers, I'm starting to get hungry thinking about this. His baked desserts are better than my mother's cakes, even though my mother is the better cook overall. When it comes to cakes and pies and the like, my father is a masterclass. He is the pastry chef between the two of them. That's the illustration, the example of higher scholarship or a higher level of scholar in a general sense of ijtihad versus the very specialized area of the Two Shaykhs. So Imam an-Nawawi and Imam ar-Rafi'i, they are the pastry chefs of the madhab. They're not vast or as vast in their knowledge as Ashab al-Wujuh. They're not on the same level, but because they applied their knowledge and their skill to a specific area, the scholarship that they produced in that area is what is relied upon in terms of what is correct or what is strongest in fatwas, according to the evidence and principles of the school. So that's a very important point to bring light to, because again, that question always comes up. If they are of a lesser status as scholars within the ranks of the scholars of the madhab, and sometimes, their opinions appear to go against the majority, how is it that we can say the Two Shaykhs, their opinion, and then after that, the opinion of Imam an-Nawawi, if there's disagreement, is the relied upon position? That's the reason. It's because of the quality and refinement that specialization brings to scholarship. So inshallah, that brings clarity to the issue, and we can appreciate the status of not only the earlier scholars of the madhab, but also our two great imams, al-Shaykhan, an-Nawawi wa ar-Rafi'i, rahimahumullah. So we will end there. And again, we thank you for listening. Jazakumullahu khairan. And insha'Allah ta'ala, we will see you on the next one. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdik. Nashhadu an la ilaha illa ant. Nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. Wassalamu alaikum.